Everybody, welcome to our next lab. Today what we're going to be talking about is testing the hypothesis that something important happened. And really what that is just talking about minimum effects testing and Bayesian approaches.
So we're going to have two parts to this lab. Like Neil said, this is basically a couple ways to test if a really important effect has happened. And so first one will be using some tables from one of Kevin's manuscripts for identifying minimum effects. And then we'll go through a demo for some really simple bare bones Bayesian analyses.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with some minimum effects practicing. So minimum effects testing, essentially all you're doing is what we were doing before was testing just with the null hypothesis. Now we're able to test within a range of values. So this can either be with just the null hypothesis where something is zero. However, now we can test is it between 0 and 1% of explained variance, 0 and 5% of explained variance. Whatever it is, we're choosing what it is that we're testing now. Is really the main thing. So now it's not just comparing to a effect of 0, but to whatever range of effects we want to test. So what the example we're going to be going with for the minimum effects testing today is using this article that we had that Kevin supplied, and we're going to say the authors used right-wing authoritarianism to predict differences in response time to in-group and out-group phases and found a squared correlation of 0.07 which was significant and an F value of 161 of 4.81. So we're going to be using that for the next few slides. So the first way we're going to do is we're going to be identifying minimum effects through Kevin's minimum effects code that he provided in lecture. So to start off, what we need to do is simply identify some things from our F value. So first, we can identify the degrees of freedom hypothesis, which is 1, our degrees of freedom error, which is 161, and then we know that our alpha value was set at 0.05, so we simply enter that into Kevin's code. And now we want to test the minimum effect of 1%. So we could enter in 0 here if we wanted to compare against the null. However, we want to test between a minimum effect of 0 and 1% and seeing if that's significant at a minimum effect of 1%. So all we do is we enter in our values, and where the red box is, you don't need to make any changes to. That's all for the calculations. And then what we do, and I'm going to have you go to the next slide, Gemma.
Just really quick, that 1% is 1% of the variance.
Yes, 1% of the variance.
Explaining at least that much.
Mm-hmm. So simply put, we explain that 1% of variance and say, are we explaining at least 1% of the variance in our outcome variable now? And what we need is an F value of 8.683388, and in order to get that 1%. However, we have found that we actually don't have that to test our minimum effect of 1% of the explained variance. So although we were comparing against the null, we had a significant effect. We don't have this when we're comparing it to 1% of minimum effect of the explained variance. So now we can go through another way of identifying the minimum effects, and this is through Murphy, Myers, and Wallach's 2014 one-stop F table, which is Appendix B in your Appendix B that Kevin supplied in the Canvas. So to start off, when we want to do this, if we want to compare to a nil effect, what we'll simply do is go find what our degrees of freedom hypothesis is 1 on our table, which is highlighted in blue, and then we find our degrees of freedom error, which is 161. However, we just have to go with the closest value. We always round down to keep conservatively, and we're going to be comparing against the nil. So we compare our nil effect, so where the red and the blue meets, that's exactly what value we're comparing. And we're comparing to a nil effect, and we find that we have an obtained F of 4.81. We compare that to the nil effect of 3.89, and we see that we do indeed have a significant effect of when we are comparing to the nil effect. However, if we want to compare to a 1% effect, we can simply bring down our red bar, and we bring it down to whatever a 1% effect is. Now, kind of similar to what we had before with Kevin's minimum effects code, we need a F value of 8.61 in order to have a significant value. So with our obtained F value of 4.81 compared to our needed F value of 8.61, we don't have enough of a significant effect by comparing these two. And then lastly, if we want to, we're going to be looking at is what our minimum sample size is needed, and we can use this from Appendix C of the Murphy and colleagues paper. So for this, what we're simply doing is tracking down what sample size we need in order to have what sample size we need to have a minimum sample size we need in order to have an obtained R-squared of 0.07. So in order to detect an effect with an R-squared value of 0.07, we simply find our degrees of freedom hypothesis, which is again 1 in this case. Then we bring it down until we have a significant effect. So really all you're doing is going down, finding on that power of 0.80, and saying where is there a point where that's lower than what our obtained R-squared value is. And here we can see at a power of 0.80, we need a sample size of at least 122. And the way I got that 122 is because it's for the degrees of freedom error is 120, and we need to add our plus k to that, which is 2 groups, so we have 122. So we need a minimum sample size of 122 to reach a 0.062 effect size, in which we are trying to get an effect size of 0.07. And then lastly, if we want to do that again, where we compare that to a 1% effect, we're going to go down on our table even more and try to find it where it's 1% power of 0.80. So as you can see, when we look at our table here, we need to, in order to get a 0.07 with a 1% minimum effect, we need a sample size of 302 to have a power of 0.80 with the effect that we've obtained of 0.07. So it's really just running through the table up and down and trying to find where the sample size, to find the desired sample size needed to have the certain power.
And I think an important thing is sometimes we can't always control what sample size we get, even if we do a power analysis beforehand. So you can use this table to backtrack and determine how much power you have for different effects as well.
Mm-hmm.
All right, moving on to part 2, we're going to go over a brief demo for Bayesian analyses. This is just going to be an example with an ANOVA. And a quick introduction to Bayesian statistics, and we do mean quick. Bayesian's a really broad field, and we're just going to go over some of the key bullet points here. We really encourage you to look at the references that we have in these slides, in addition to what Kevin provided you. These are great training grounds for getting your feet wet and learning these analyses. Bayesian statistics are increasingly popular in psychology. They allow us to make probabilistic statements about events and different hypotheses. And importantly, they account for background knowledge, prior distributions and information about variables and about different topics. These two things are really important because they could be a workaround for some of the limitations that the field of psychology has had. For example, the reproducibility crisis, our tendency to have to rely on really large sample sizes. Bayesian analyses can be kind of a workaround for that. And it's really important to note that pretty much all common statistical analyses, essentially everything we've covered in this class, can be conducted in a Bayesian framework. So you're still running the same test, you're still asking the same questions, but you're interpreting things differently. The interpretations are also often more concrete than significance tests. So we're making more clear probability statements. We'll talk about that on the next slide a bit. There's an interesting article we cited down at the bottom if you want to read a little more about the debate between Bayesian and frequentist statistics. This table is from a really great paper by Van de Schut et al. And it really covers some of the difference between frequentist statistics, which include our classic null hypothesis significance testing, and Bayesian statistics. And I think one of the best ways to think about it is the idea that in frequentist statistics, we're estimating that there's a true value of the population. So when we estimate a slope or we estimate a mean, we're saying that it's fixed. So we're trying to estimate one value. Whereas in Bayesian analyses, we're more likely to say there could be multiple different values for this, so we're going to interpret all of our effects as being a probability distribution. I think another important difference here, so frequentist statistics are basically telling us how likely is our data if the null hypothesis was true. Whereas Bayesian statistics give us statements about evidence for and against different hypotheses, including evidence for the null and evidence for other hypotheses. So we get a little bit more information. Again, this is going to be a simple breakdown for Bayesian, but hopefully it's a good starting point. What we're going to be covering in this lab are Bayes factors, which are similar to an effect size. They're indices of relative evidence of one model or hypothesis over another. This table here is from Wetzels et al., and it's showing us the different levels of interpretation for p-values, effect sizes, and Bayes factors. You'll see everything above a 1 for Bayes factors are evidence for the alternative hypothesis. Evidence for the hypothesis that you're testing is true. Bayes factors less than 1 are evidence for the null hypothesis compared to the alternative hypothesis. This is what we're going to be using here. You should also note that you can still get p-values and effect sizes in a Bayesian framework. They're just interpreted a little differently. But today we're just focusing on Bayes factors.
All right, so per usual, we're going to be loading in our libraries and reading in our data first. So to start, we're going to be using a library called Bayes Factor, which you'll probably have to install, and we'll be using the retirement CSV file, which has 1,910 observations of 3 variables, and within here, there's 3 different variables in there. And to start off, we are going to go ahead and factor our categorical variables. So we're going to first factor out the sex variable. So level 1 is female, level 2 is male. And then we're also going to factor out our occupation variable, which has 6 different levels to it, which is professor, manager, non-manual, skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled workers. We're going to do this because for the Bayes factor analyses, it really helps out a lot to have. In fact, it's even required to have factored variables to run it with the Bayes analyses. All right, so just so we can have everything in comparison, we're actually going to run a regular ANOVA. So using a frequentist ANOVA, where we're going to do mental health regressed on sex and occupation and the interaction between the two as well. And then per usual, we like to also have our effect sizes. So remember, your effect sizes is the SS effect over the total effect. So that's the total SS. So you're going to go ahead and just do those manually. So we give you the code how to do the actual ANOVA on the left, and then to calculate the actual eta squared values on the right. And so when we do this, so as we can see, the only significant result that we find is that occupation predicts mental health, and this effect has the largest eta squared value, suggesting that occupation explains about 3% of the variance in mental health overall. So keep that in mind for when you are running through the rest of the analyses as well.
Now we're going to go through and ask the same question, running the same ANOVA with the same variables, but in a Bayesian framework. And we're going to have 3 steps here. We're going to do all models, we're going to do top-down, and we're going to do bottom-down. And you'll see that all 3 of these help us reach the same conclusion, but they give us a little bit more information when we do all 3 together instead of just one. So the first one, we're using the Bayes factor package, and the function name is ANOVA BF. And then you're going to put in your ANOVA function in the same way that you did before with a mental health regressed on sex, occupation, and the interaction between the two. You have your data set name, and then which models equal all. You'll see that's going to change in other slides. So when you have all models, this gives us the Bayes factor for each possible model. These values over here in the middle column, those are your Bayes factors, and then you have the standard errors over to the right. On the left are our models. And so you'll notice this gives us the Bayes factor for each model compared to the null model. So we have the model that only includes sex, the model that only includes occupation, the model that only includes the interaction between the two, the model that includes the two main effects but not the interaction, and so on. You notice this is different than what we get in our normal, for example, ANOVA in regression output, in that it'll also give us main effects plus the interaction, not including the other main effect. It'll really parse out every possible way to look at the variables. One quick note, the colon in between the two variables, in this notation, that's their interaction term. So it's the same as having an asterisk in between the variables. All right, now that you're oriented to what we're looking at, here's our main takeaway. Remember from that slide on the table of different ranges of Bayes factors and how anything over 100 is decisive evidence for the hypothesis? Essentially here we're seeing all of the models that have occupation as a main effect, occupation as a standalone effect, have a really big Bayes factor, over 100. So we're seeing that there is decisive evidence that occupation is predicting mental health. You notice that the variables that don't include occupation as a main effect have small Bayes factors. These are going to be evidence for the null hypothesis, saying basically that sex and the interaction between sex and occupation aren't predicting mental health. And something that's really cool about this package is just with the one line of code plot your model name, it'll give you this plot where it helps you visualize what's happening with your Bayes factors. Over here on the y-axis, these are all of the models. They're listed in order of Bayes factor size. And then we have Bayes factor going along the x-axis. The ones in yellow are less than 1. Those are evidence for the null hypothesis. And the ones in purple are evidence for the alternative hypothesis, the hypothesis that you're testing. So it's a way to plot out and really visualize, what impacts are these variables all making? Which models have the best fit compared to the others?
Yeah.
All right. Unless you want to jump in, Neil, I'll keep going.
Keep going.
So the next step we'll do, we're going to run the same ANOVA, but this time with a top-down approach. And what this means is we're going to get the model's Bayes factor when each effect is eliminated one at a time. Same code as the previous slide. The only thing we changed is we renamed our model to something else, and for which models we put top. And so what we're looking at here is basically what's left of the Bayes factor as we take each of these variables out. Looking at the results, the main takeaway is that when you take the main effect of occupation out of the model, we're left with a really tiny Bayes factor. The Bayes factor is still pretty high when you just omit sex or when you just omit the interaction term, but it really tanks and goes to supporting the null hypothesis when you take out occupation. And once again, we plotted that for you, the simple line of code just plot. Again, it's showing in yellow here, when we take occupation away, the Bayes factor really shrinks. So that must be an important part of the model's predictive power. And our last step here is, again, same analysis, but this time from a bottom-up approach. What's the change in the model's Bayes factor when each effect is added one at a time? Another way to look at the importance of each variable. Here we're seeing really the same picture. When you add occupation to the model, that's when we get a Bayes factor that has strong evidence for the hypothesis alternative that occupation predicts mental health. When occupation isn't added into the model yet, we have this really tiny less than 1 Bayes factor, which is showing evidence for the null hypothesis. Again, we plotted it out. Adding occupation makes the Bayes factor go a lot up for the model. All right, so our summary of results. So all 3 of these approaches that we did support the same conclusion. We have decisive evidence to support the hypothesis that occupation influences mental health. as indicated by the Bayes factors being greater than 100 for models that include occupation as a main effect. We have strong evidence to support the null hypothesis that sex identity influences mental health. And that's from that cutoff from that table for strong evidence versus decisive evidence. Then there's decisive evidence to support the null hypothesis that the interaction term between sex and occupation influences mental health. So we have evidence for the null hypothesis for 2 of the effects and evidence for the alternative hypothesis for the occupation effect.
And okay, I'll jump in here. Yeah, so really what we're going to do now is just compare our regular ANOVA versus the Bayesian ANOVA that we had at the end here. So really what we're finding is that both of these analyses indicate that occupation predicts mental health, while gender and the interaction between gender and occupation don't necessarily contribute toward predict mental health. So although they're coming to the same conclusions, really we can see that the Bayesian approach provides more information than the frequentist approach. For example, it has more degrees of evidence for the null hypotheses, and also it has more concrete statements about how well supported each of our model hypotheses are compared to the alternative hypotheses. So we're actually seeing which is adding more to the null hypotheses and which is adding more to the alternative hypotheses. So although they reach the same exact conclusions, what we find is that the Bayesian approach really tells us more overall about what's going on and how it relates to the alternative hypothesis.
And in the background, this model is also accounting for more information that's coming from the data. But on that note, Bayesian analyses are a really, really broad field, and they're, in my experience, more accessible than I thought they would be when I started reading about them. But we've really barely scratched the surface in this activity. We hope that by getting some experience with Bayes factors, that'll be a good starting point. But these are some resources that we found especially helpful if you really want to go in and learn some of these. These are highly recommended.
All right. Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody.
Sweet, thanks.